I saw the Fnords the same day I first heard about the plastic martini. Let me be very clear and precise about this, since many of the people on this trip are deliberately and perversely obscure. I would not, could not, have seen the Fnords if Hagbard hadn't hypnotized me the night before on the flying saucer. I had been reading Pat Walsh's memos at home and listening to a new record from the Museum of Natural History. I was adding a few new samples to my collection of Washington Weishaupt pictures on the wall when the saucer appeared hovering outside my window. Needless to say, it didn't particularly surprise me. I had saved a little of the after Chicago, contrary to the instructions from Elf, and had dosed myself. After meeting with the Dalai Lama, not to mention Malaclips the Elder, and seeing that nut Chelene actually talk to gorillas, I assumed my mind was a point of receptivity where the would trigger something truly original. The UFO, in fact, was a bit of a letdown. So many people had seen them already, and I was ready for something nobody had ever seen or imagined. It was even more a disappointment when they psyched me or slurped me aboard, and I found, instead of Martians or insect trust delegates from the Crab Galaxy, just Hagbard, Stella Maris, and a few other people from the Leif Erikson.
"Hail, Eris," said Hagbard.
"All hail Discordia," I replied, giving the 3-after-2 pattern and completing the pentad. "Is this something important, or did you just want to show me your latest invention?" The inside of the saucer was, to be trite, eerie. Everything was non-Euclidean and semi-transparent. I kept feeling that I might fall through the floor and hurtle to the ground to smash myself on the sidewalk. Then we started moving, and it got worse.
"Don't let the architecture disturb you," Hagbard said. "My own adaptation of some of Bucky Fuller's synergetic geometry. It's smaller and more solid than it looks. You won't fall out, believe me."
"Is this contraption behind all the flying saucer reports since 1947? I asked curiously.
"Not quite," Hagbard laughed. "That is basically a hoax. The plan was created in the United States government, one of the few ideas they have had without direct Illuminati inspiration since about the middle of Roosevelt's first term. A reserve measure in case something happens to Russia and China."
"Hi, baby," I said softly to Stella, remembering San Francisco. "Would you tell me, minus the Chilean rhetoric and paradox, what the hell he's talking about?"
"The state is based on threat,"
Stella said simply.
"If people aren't afraid of something, they'll realize they don't need that big government hand picking their pockets all the time. So, in case Russia and China collapse from internal dissension, or get into a private war and blow each other to hell, or suffer some unexpected natural calamity like a series of earthquakes, the saucer myth has been planted. If there are no earthly enemies to frighten the American people with, the saucer myth will immediately change. There will be evidence that they come from Mars and are planning to invade and enslave us. Dig?"
"So," Hagbard added, "I built this little gizmo and I can travel anywhere I want without interference. Any sighting of this craft, whether by a radar operator with 20 years' experience or a little old lady in Perth Amboy, is regarded by the government as a case of auto-suggestion, since they know they didn't plant it themselves. I can hover over cities like New York or military installations that are top secret or any place I damn well please. Nice?"
"Very nice," I said. "But why did you bring me up here?"
"It's time for you to see the Fnords," he replied.
Then I woke up in bed, and it was the next morning. I made breakfast in a pretty nasty mood, wondering if I'd seen the Fnords, whatever the hell they were, in the hours he had blacked out, or if I would see them as soon as I went out in the street. I had some pretty gruesome ideas about them, I must admit. Creatures with 3 eyes and tentacles, survivors from Atlantis who walked among us, invisible due to some form of mind shield, and did hideous work for the Illuminati. It was unnerving to contemplate, and I finally gave in to my fears and peeked out the window, thinking it might be better to see them from a distance first. Nothing. Just ordinary sleepy people heading for their buses and subways. That calmed me a little, so I set out the toast and coffee and fetched in the New York Times from the hallway. I turned the radio to WBAI and caught some good Vivaldi, sat down, grabbed a piece of toast, and started skimming the first page. Then I saw the Fnords. The feature story involved another of the endless squabbles between Russia and the U.S. in the UN General Assembly, and after each direct quote from the Russian delegate, I read a quite distinct Fnord. The second lead was about a debate in Congress on getting the troops out of Costa Rica. Every argument presented by Senator Bacon was followed by another Fnord. At the bottom of the page was a Times depth-type study of the growing pollution problem and the increasing use of gas masks among New Yorkers. The most distressing chemical facts were interpolated with more Fnords. Suddenly, I saw Hagbard's eyes burning into me and heard his voice.
Your heart will remain calm. Your adrenaline gland will remain calm. Calm all over. Calm. You will not panic. You will look at the Fnord and see it. You will not evade it or black it out. You will stay calm and face it.
And further back, way back, my first-grade teacher writing Fnord on the blackboard, while a wheel with a spiral design turned and turned on his desk, turned, and his voice droned on. If you don't see the Fnord, it can't eat you. Don't see the Fnord. Don't see the Fnord. I looked back at the paper and still saw the Fnords. This was one step beyond Pavlov, I realized. The first conditioned reflex was to experience the panic reaction, the activation syndrome it's technically called, whenever encountering the word Fnord. The second conditioned reflex was to black out what happened, including the word itself, and just to feel a general low-grade emergency without knowing why. And the third step, of course, was to attribute this anxiety to the news stories, which were bad enough in themselves anyway. Of course, the essence of control is fear. The Fnords produced a whole population walking around in chronic low-grade emergency, tormented by ulcers, dizzy spells, nightmares, heart palpitations, and all the other symptoms of too much adrenaline. All my left-wing arrogance and contempt for my countrymen melted, and I felt genuine pity. No wonder the poor bastards believe anything they're told, walk through pollution and overcrowding without complaining, watch their sons hauled off to endless wars and butchered, never protest, never fight back, never show much happiness or eroticism or curiosity or normal human emotion, live with perpetual tunnel vision, walk past a slum without seeing either the human misery it contains or the potential threat it poses to their security. Then I got a hunch and turned quickly to the advertisements. It was as I expected. No Fnords. That was part of the gimmick, too. Only in consumption, endless consumption, could they escape the amorphous threat of the invisible Fnords. I kept thinking about it on my way to the office. If I pointed out a Fnord to somebody who hadn't been deconditioned, as Hagbard deconditioned me, what would he or she say? They'd probably read the word before or after it. No, this word, I'd say, and they would again read an adjacent word. But would their panic level rise as the threat came closer to consciousness? I preferred not to try the experiment. It might have ended with a psychotic fugue in the subject. The conditioning, after all, went back to grade school. No wonder we all hate those teachers so much. We have a dim, masked memory of what they've done to us in converting us into good and faithful servants for the Illuminati. When I arrived at my desk, Peter Jackson handed me a press release.
"What do you make of this?"
he asked with a puzzled frown, and I looked at the mimeographed first page. The old eye and pyramid design leaped out at me. Demolay Frères invite you to the premiere debut of the world's first plastic nude martini, the press release declared. On second glance, the eye in the triangle turned into the elliptical rim of a martini glass, while the pupil in the eye was actually the olive floating in the cocktail.
"What the hell is a plastic nude martini?"
said Peter Jackson.
"And why would they invite us to a press party for one?"
"You can bet that it's non-biodegradable,"
said Joe.
"Which will make it very unfashionable with honky ecology freaks,"
said Peter sarcastically.
Joe squinted at the design again. It could be a coincidence, But coincidence was just another word for synchronicity.
I think I'll go,
he said.
And what's that?
He added, as his eye fell upon a half-unfolded poster on his desk.
Oh, that came with the latest American Medical Association album,
said Peter.
I don't want it, and I thought you might. It's time you took those pictures of the Rolling Stones off your wall. This is the age of constantly accelerating change, and a man who displays old pictures of the Stones is liable to be labeled a reactionary.
4 owl-eyed faces stared at him. They were dressed in one-piece white suits, and 3 of them were joining extended hands to form a triangle, while the 4th, Wolfgang Saure, generally acknowledged to be the leader of the group, stood with his arms folded in the center. The picture was taken from above so that the most prominent elements were the 4 heads, while the outstretched arms clearly made the sides of the triangle, and the bodies seemed unimportant, dwindling away to nothing. The background was jet black. The 3 young men and the woman, with their smooth-shaven, bony faces, their blonde crew cuts, and their icy blue eyes, seemed extremely sinister to Joe. If the Nazis had won the war and Heinrich Himmler had followed Hitler as the ruler of the German Empire, kids like this would be running the world. And they almost were in a different sense, because they had succeeded the Beatles and Stones as kings of music, which made them emperors among youth. Although long hair remained the general fashion, the kids had accepted the American Medical Association's antiseptic clean appearance as a needed reaction against a style that had become too commonplace. As Wolfgang himself had said,
"If you need an outward sign to know your own, you don't really belong."
They give me the creeps,
said Joe.
What did you think when the Beatles first came out?
Said Peter.
Joe shrugged.
They gave me the creeps. They looked ugly and sexless and like teenage werewolves with all that hair, and they seemed to be able to mesmerize 12-year-old girls.
Peter nodded.
The bulk of the AMA's fans are even younger. You might want to start conditioning yourself to them now. They're going to be around for a long time.
Peter, let's you and me have lunch,
Joe said.
Then I'm going to get some work done, and then I'm going to leave here at 4 to go to this plastic martini party. First of all, though, hold the chair for me while I take down the stones and put up the American Medical Association.
The De Molay Frere group wasn't kidding, he found. There were martinis, olives and all, or cocktail onions for those who preferred them, in transparent plastic bags that were shaped like nude women. Pretty terrible taste the manufacturer had, thought Joe. Briefly, Joe wondered if it would be a good idea to infiltrate this company so as to get dosages of in all the plastic nude martinis. But then he remembered the emblem and thought maybe this company was already infiltrated. But by which side? There was a beautiful Oriental girl in the room. She had black hair that reached all the way down to the small of her back, and when she raised her arms to adjust a head ornament, Joe was surprised to see thick black hair in her armpits.
Orientals did not normally have much body hair,
he thought.
Could she be some relation to the hairy Ainu of northern Japan?
It intrigued him, turned him on as he never thought armpit hair would, and he went over to her to talk. The first thing he noticed was that the headband she wore had a golden apple with the letter K printed right on it in the center of her forehead.
She is one of us,
he thought. His hunch about coming to this party was right.
These martini bags sure have a silly shape,
said Joe.
Why? Don't you care for nude women?
Well, this has about as much to do with nude women as any other piece of plastic,
said Joe.
Now, my point is that it's in such execrable taste. But then all of American industry is nothing but a giant obscene circus to me. What's your name?
The black eyes fixed his intently.
Mao Tzu-shi.
Any relation?
No, my name means cat in Chinese. His doesn't. His name is Mao, but mine is Mao.
Joe was enchanted by the enunciation of the 2 different tones.
Well, Miss Cat, you are the most attractive woman I've met in ages.
She responded with a silent flirtation of her own, and they were soon in a wonderfully interesting conversation, which he could never remember afterwards, nor did he notice the pinch of powder she dropped into his drink. He began feeling strangely groggy. Tzu-shi took his arm and led him to the check room. They got their coats, left the building, and hailed a cab. In the back seat, they kissed for a long time. She opened her coat, and he pulled the zipper that went all the way down the front of her dress. He felt her breasts and stroked her belly, then dropped his head into her bush. She was wearing no underwear. She draped her legs over his, using her coat to screen what was going on from the cab driver, and helped him expose his erect penis. With a few quick, agile movements, she had swept her skirt out of the way, raised her little seat into the air, and slid her well-lubricated cunt down over his cock and was fucking him side-saddle. It could have been difficult and awkward, but she was so light and well-coordinated that she managed to bring herself to orgasm easily and voluptuously. She drew in her breath sharply through her teeth, and a shudder ran through her body. She rested her head momentarily on his shoulder, then raised herself slightly and helped Joe to a pleasant climax with a rotary motion of her ass. The experience, Joe realized, would have been more exquisite a few months or a few years earlier. Now, with his growing sensitivity, he was conscious of what had been missing, the actual energetic contact. The effect of the jams and the discordians on him, he reflected, had been paradoxical by ordinary standards. He was no more puritanical than before they started tinkering with his nervous system. He was less, but at the same time, casual sex was less appealing to him. He remembered Atlanta Hope's diatribes against sexism in her book Telemachus Sneezed, the Bible of the God's Lightning Movement, and he suddenly saw some weird kind of sense in her rantings. The sexual revolution in America was as much of a fraud as the political revolutions in China and Russia, Atlanta had written with her usual exuberant capitalization. She was, in a way, quite right. People today were still wrapped in a cellophane of false ego, and even if they fucked and had orgasms together, the cellophane was still there, and no real contact had been made. And yet, if Mao was what he suspected, she would know this even better than he did. Was this quick, cool spasm some kind of test, or some lesson, or demonstration? If so, how was he supposed to respond? And then he remembered that she had not given an address to the driver. The cab had been waiting only for them, to take them to a predetermined place, for reasons unknown.
I've seen the Fnords,
he thought.
Now I'm going to see more.
The cab stopped on a narrow, heavily shadowed street that seemed to be all empty stores, factory buildings, loading docks, and warehouses. With Miss Mao leading, they entered an old, dilapidated-looking loft building, with the aid of a key she had in her handbag, climbed some clanging cast-iron stairs, walked hand-in-hand down a long, dark corridor, and came at last, through a series of anterooms, each better appointed than the last, to a splendid boardroom. Joe shook his head, amazed at what he saw, but there was something, he suspected a drug, that was keeping him docile and passive. Around a table sat men and women, costumed from various eras of human history. Joe recognized Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Mongol, and Polynesian dress, also classical Greek and Roman, medieval and Renaissance. There were other outfits more difficult to recognize at first glance. A Flying Dutch board meeting, Joe thought to himself. They were talking about the Illuminati, the Discordians, the Jams, and the Arisians. A man wearing a steel breastplate and helmet with gold inlay and a neatly trimmed mustache and goatee said,
"It is now possible to predict with 98% probability of accuracy that the Illuminati are setting up Fernando Poo for an international crisis. The question is, do we raid the island and get the records now, making sure they're not endangered, or do we wait and take advantage of the trouble as a cover for our raid?"
A man in a dragon-embroidered red silk robe said,
"There will be no way to take advantage of the trouble, in my opinion. It will seem like chaos on the surface, but underneath, the Illuminati will have everything very much under control. Now is the time to move."
A woman in a translucent silk blouse whose little vest did not hide her dark, rounded breasts said,
"You realize this could be a lovely scoop for your magazine, Mr. Malik. You could send a reporter there to look into conditions on Fernando Poo. Equatorial Guinea has all the usual problems of a developing African nation. Will tribal rivalries flare up between the booby and the fang, preventing the further development of national cooperation? Will the poverty of the mainland province lead to attempts to expropriate the wealth of Fernando Poo? And what of the army? What, for example, of a certain Captain Jesus Tequila Imota? An interview with the captain might prove to be a journalistic coup 3 years from now."
"Yes,"
said a big woman in colorfully dyed furs who played incessantly with the carved leg bone of some large animal.
"We don't expect C.L. Schultzberger to grasp the importance of Fernando Poo until the crisis is upon the world. So, if advance warning is desirable, and we think it is, why not through confrontation?"
Is that why you asked me here?
said Joe.
To tell me something is going to happen in Fernando Poo? Where the hell is Fernando Poo anyway?
Look it up in an atlas when you get back to work. It's one of several volcanic islands off the coast of Africa,
said a dark-skinned, slit-eyed man wearing a buffalo hide decorated with feathers.
Of course you understand that you could only hint at the real forces of work there.
He added.
For instance, we wouldn't want you to mention that Fernando Poo is one of the last outcroppings of the continent of Atlantis, you know?
Mao Sushi was standing beside Joe with a glass containing a pinkish liquid.
Here, drink this,
she said.
It will sharpen your perceptions.
A man in a gold braid-encrusted field marshal's uniform said,
Mr. Malik is the next business in order on our agenda. We are to educate him to some extent. Let's do it to that extent.
The lights in the room went out. There was a rustling at one end, and suddenly Joe was looking at a brightly lit movie screen.
When Atlantis Ruled the Earth. The title appears in letters that look like blocks of stone piled on top of one another to form a kind of step pyramid. It is followed by shots of the Earth as it looked 30,000 years ago, during the Great Ice Ages, showing woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and Cro-Magnon hunters, while at the same time the greatest civilization ever known by man is flourishing on the continent of Atlantis. The Atlanteans do not know anything about good or evil. However, they all live to be 500 years old and have no fear of death. The bodies of all Atlanteans are covered with fur, as with apes. After seeing various domestic scenes in Zukang-Gimorlad Saragossa, the largest and most central city on the continent, but not the capital because the Atlanteans do not have a government, we move to a laboratory where the young, 100-years-old scientist Gruad is displaying a biological experiment to an associate, Gua Tuon. The experiment is a giant water-dwelling serpent man. Gua Tuon is impressed, but Gruad declares that he is bored. He wishes to change himself in some unexpected way. Gruad is already strange. Unlike other Atlanteans, he is not covered with fur, but has only short blonde hair on top of his head and a closed cropped beard. In comparison to other Atlanteans, he seems hideously naked. He wears a high-colored pale green robe and gauntlets. He tells Gua Tuon that he is tired of accumulating knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It's just another guise for the pursuit of pleasure, to which too many of our fellow Atlanteans devote their lives. Of course, there's nothing wrong with pleasure. It moves the energies. But I feel that there is something higher and more heroic. I have no name for it yet, but I know it exists. Gua Tuon is somewhat shocked. You, as a scientist, can talk of knowing something exists when you have no evidence? Gruad is dejected by this and admits, My lens needs polishing. But after a moment he bounces back. And yet, even though I have my moments of doubt, I think my lens really is clear. Of course, I must find the evidence, but even now, before I start, I feel that I know what I will find. We could be greater and finer than we are. I look at what I am and sometimes I despise myself. I'm just a clever animal, an ape who has learned to play with tools. I want to be much more. I say we can be what the Luigor are and even more. We can conquer time and seize eternity, even as they have. I mean to achieve that, or destroy myself in the attempt. The scene shifts to a banquet hall where Ingolrild, a venerable Atlantean scientist, has called together prominent Atlanteans to celebrate a space research achievement, the production of a solar flare. Ingolrild and his associates have developed a missile which, when it strikes the sun, can cause an explosion. He tells the marijuana-smoking gathering, we can control to the second the timing of the flare, and to the millimeter the distance it will spring out from the sun. A flare of sufficient magnitude could burn our planet to a crisp. A small flare could bombard the Earth with radiation such as the area closest to the sun would be destroyed, while the rest of our world would suffer drastic changes. Most serious of all, perhaps, would be the biological changes these excessive radiations would bring about. Life forms would be damaged and perhaps become extinct. New life forms would arise. All of nature would undergo a tremendous upheaval. This has happened naturally once or twice. It happened 70 million years ago when the dinosaurs were suddenly wiped out and replaced by mammals. We still have much to learn about the mechanism that produces spontaneous solar flares. However, to be able to cause them artificially is a step towards predicting and possibly controlling them. When that stage is reached, our planet and our race will be protected from the kind of catastrophe that destroyed the dinosaurs. After the applause, a woman named Kajetsi asked whether it might not be disrespectful to tamper with our father, the sun. Ingolrild replies that man is a part of nature and what he does is natural and can't be construed as tampering. Now Gruad interrupts angrily, pointing out that he, an unattractive mutation, is the product of tampering with nature. He tells Ingolrild that the Atlanteans do not truly understand nature and the order that controls it. He declares that man is subject to laws. All things in nature are, but man is different because he can disobey the natural laws that govern him. Gruad goes on. With humanity we can speak, as we speak of our own machines, in terms of performance expected and performance delivered. If a machine does not do what it is designed for, we try to correct it. We want it to do what it ought to do, what it should do. I think we have the right and the duty to demand the same of people, that they perform as they ought to and should perform. An aged and merry-eyed scientist named Love Karaft interrupts. But people are not machines, Gruad. Exactly, Gruad answers. I have already considered that. Therefore, I have created new words, words even stronger than should and ought. When a person performs as he or she should and ought, I call that good, and anything less than this I call evil. This outlandish notion is greeted with general laughter. Gruad tries to speak persuasively, conscious of his lonely position as a pioneer, trying desperately to communicate with the closed minds all around him. After further argument, though, he becomes threatening, declaring, "The people of Atlantis do not live according to the law. In their pride they strike the sun itself, and boast of it, as you have, Ingolrild, this day. I say that if Atlanteans do not live according to the law, a disaster will befall them, a disaster that will shake the entire earth. You have been warned. Heed my words." Gruad strides majestically out of the banquet hall, seizing his cloak at the door and sweeping it about him as he leaves. Kajetsi follows him and tells him that she thinks she partly understands what he has been trying to say. The laws he speaks of are like the wishes of parents, and the great bodies of the universe are our parents, isn't that so? Gruad's naked hand strokes Kajetsi's furred cheek, and they go off into the darkness together. Within 6 months, Gruad has formed an organization called the Party of Science. Their banner is an eye inside a triangle, which in turn is surrounded by a serpent with its tail in its mouth. The Party of Science demands that Atlantis publish the natural laws Gruad has discovered, and make them binding on all, with systems of reward and punishment to enforce them. The word punishment is another addition to the Atlantean vocabulary coined by Gruad. One of Gruad's opponents explains to friends of his that it means torture, and everyone's fur bristles. Ingolrild announces to a gathering of his supporters that Gruad has proven to his own satisfaction, and the demonstration runs to 72 scrolls of logical symbols, that sex is a part of what he calls evil. Only sex for the good of the community is to be permitted under Gruad's system, to keep the race alive. A scientist called Tunlit exclaims, "You mean we must be thinking about conception during the act? That's impossible. Men's penises would droop and women's vaginas wouldn't get moist. It's like making the shrill mouth music while you are urinating. It would take great training if it can be done at all." Ingolrild proposes the formation of a party of freedom to oppose Gruad. Discussing Gruad's personality, Ingolrild says he checked the genealogical records and found that several of the most agitated energy people in all Atlantean history were among his ancestors. Gruad is a mutation, and so are many of his followers. The energy of normal Atlanteans flows slowly. Gruad's people are impatient and frustrated, and this is what makes them want to inflict suffering on their fellow humans.
Joe sat up with a jolt. If he understood that part of the movie, Gruad, evidently the first Illuminatus, was also the first Homo neophilus. And the Party of Freedom, which seemed to be the origin of the Discordian and Jam movements, was pure Homo neophobus. How the hell could that be squared with the generally reactionary attitude of current Illuminati policies, and the innovativeness of the Discordians and Jams? But the film was moving on.
In a disreputable-looking tavern-like place, where men and women smoke dope in pipes that they pass from one to another, while people grope in couples and groups in dark corners, Sylvain Martiset proposes a party of nothingness that rejects the positions of both the Party of Science and the Party of Freedom. After this we see street fighting, atrocities, the infliction of punishment on harmless people by men wearing Gruad's eye and triangle badge. The Party of Freedom proclaims its own symbol, a golden apple. The fighting spreads, the numbers of the dead mount, and Ingolrild weeps. He and his associates decide on a desperate expedient, unleashing the Loigor Yog-Sothoth. They will offer this unnatural, soul-eating energy being from another universe its freedom in return for its help in destroying Gruad's movement. Yog-Sothoth is imprisoned in the great Pentagon of Atlantis on a desolate moor in the southern part of the continent. The Atlantean electric plane bearing Ingolrild, Tunlit, and another scientist drifts, trailing feathery sparks, to a landing in a flat field overgrown with gray weeds. Within the Pentagon, an enormous black stone structure, the ground is scorched and the air shimmers like a heat mirage. Flickers of static electricity run through the shimmering from time to time, and an unpleasant noise, like flies around a corpse, pervades the whole moor. The faces of the three Atlantean sages register disgust, sickness, and terror. They climb the nearest tower and talk to the guard. Suddenly, Yog-Sothoth takes control of Tunlit, speaking in an oily, rich, deep, and reverberating voice, and asks them what they seek of him. Tunlit lets out a terrible shriek and claps his hands over his ears. Froth slips from the side of his mouth, his fur bristles, and his penis stands erect. His eyes are delirious and suffering, like those of a dying gorilla. The electronic ray drives him back, and he stands panting, tongue hanging loose, as the Pentagon first and then the ground begin to soften into asymptotic curves. Yog-Sothoth chants, Log-nich, hog-nich, hog-nich, fathogn. Log-nich, hog-nich, hog-nich, hagwal. The blood is the life, the blood is the life. All faces, bodies, and perspectives are skewed, and there is a greenish tinge on everything. Suddenly, the guard strikes the nearest wall of the Pentagon directly with his electronic wand, and Tunlit shrieks, human intelligence coming back into his eyes, together with great shame and revulsion. The three sages flee the Pentagon under a sky slowly turning back to its normal shape and color. The laughter of Yog-Sothoth follows them. They decide that they cannot release the Loigor. Meanwhile, Gruad has called his closest followers, known as the Unbroken Circle of Gruad, to announce that Kajetsi has conceived. Then he shows them a group of man-like creatures with green scaly skin, wearing long black cloaks and black skull-caps with scarlet plumes. These he calls his Ephedians. Since Atlanteans have a kind of instinctive check on themselves that prevents them from killing except in blind fury, Gruad has developed these synthetic humanoids from the serpent, which he has found to be the most intelligent of all reptiles. They will have no hesitation about destroying men and will act only on Gruad's command. Some of his followers protest, and Gruad explains that this is not really killing. He says, Atlanteans who will not accept the teachings of the Party of Science are swinish beings. They are a sort of robot who has no inner spiritual substance to control it. Our bodies, however, are deceived into feeling as if they are our own kind, and we cannot raise our hands against them. Now, however, the light of science has given us hands to raise. At this meeting, Gruad also addresses his men for the first time as the Illuminated Ones. At this meeting, Gruad also addresses his men for the first time as the Illuminated Ones. At the next meeting of the Party of Freedom, the Ophidians attack, using iron bars to club people to death and slashing throats with their fangs. Then the Party of Freedom holds a funeral for a dozen of its dead, at which Ingolrild gives an oration describing the ways in which the struggle between Gruad's followers and the other Atlanteans is changing the character of all human beings. Hitherto, Atlanteans have enjoyed knowledge but not worried over the fact that there is much that we do not know. We are conservative and indifferent to new ideas, we have no inner conflicts, and we feel like doing the things that seem wise to us. We think that the things we feel like doing will usually work out for the best. We consider pain and pleasure a single phenomenon, which we call sensation, and we respond to unavoidable pain by relaxing or becoming ecstatic. We do not fear death. We can read each other's minds because we are in touch with all the energies of our bodies. The followers of Gruad have lost that ability, and they are thankful that they have. The scientists dote on new things and new ideas. This love of the new thing is a matter of genetic manipulation. Gruad is even encouraging people in their 20s to have children, though it is our custom never to have children before we reach 100. The generations of Gruad's followers come thick and fast, and they are not like us. They agonize over their ignorance. They are full of uncertainty and inner conflict between what they should do and what they feel like doing. The children who are brought up on Gruad's teachings are even more disturbed and conflict-filled than their parents. One doctor tells me that the attitudes and the way of life Gruad is encouraging in his people is enough to shorten their lifespans considerably, and they are afraid of pain. They are afraid of death, and even as their lives grow shorter, they desperately seek for some means of achieving immortality. Gruad tells a meeting of his unbroken circle that the time has come to intensify the struggle. If they can't rule the Atlanteans, they will destroy Atlantis. Atlantis will be destroyed by light, says Gruad. By the light of the sun. Gruad introduces the worship of the sun to his followers. He reveals the existence of gods and goddesses. They are all energy, conscious energy, says Gruad. This conscious and powerfully directed and focused pure energy I call spirit. All motion is spirit. All light is spirit. All spirit is light. Under Gruad's direction, the party of science builds a great pyramid, thousands of feet high. It is in two halves, the upper half made of an indestructible ceramic substance and inscribed with a terrible staring eye, floats 500 feet above the base, held in place by anti-gravity generators. A band of men and women, led by Lilith Velkor, chief spokeswoman for the Party of Nothingness, gathers at the base of the Great Pyramid and laughs at it. They carry Nothingarian signs. "Don't clean our lenses, Gruad. Get the crack out of your own. Every time I hear the word progress, my fur bristles. The sun sucks. Freedom defined is freedom denied. The message on this sign is a flat lie." Lilith Velkor addresses the Nothingarians, satirizing all Gruad's beliefs, claiming that the most powerful god is a crazy woman, and she is the goddess of chaos. To the accompaniment of laughter she declares, "Gruad says the sun is the eye of the sun god. That's more of his notion that males are superior and reason and order are superior. Actually, the sun is a giant golden apple, which is the plaything of the goddess of chaos, and it's the property of anyone she thinks is fair enough to deserve it." Suddenly, a band of Ophidians attacks followers of Lilith Velkor and kills several of them. Lilith Velkor leads her people in an unprecedented attack on the Ophidians. They storm up the side of the Great Pyramid and throw the Ophidians down to the street, killing them. Amazingly, they succeed in wiping out all the Ophidians. Gruad declares that Lilith Velkor must die. When the opportunity presents itself, his men seize her and take her to a dungeon. There, An enormous wheel has been constructed with 4 spokes in the shape of a peace sign. Lilith Velkor is crucified with ropes upside down on this device. Several members of the party of science lounge about, watching her die. Gruad enters, goes to the wheel and looks at the dying woman, who says, "This is as good a day to die as any." Gruad remonstrates with her, saying that death is a great evil, and she should fear it. She laughs and says, "All my life I have despised tradition, and now I despise innovation also. Surely I must be a most wicked example for the world." She dies laughing. Gruad's rage is unbearable. He vows that he will wait no longer. Atlantis is too wicked to save, and he will destroy it. On a windswept plain in the northern regions of Atlantis, a huge teardrop-shaped rocket with graceful fins is poised on the launching pad. Gruad is in the control room making last-minute adjustments while Kajetsi and Woe Tupad argue with him. Gruad says, "The human race will survive. It will survive the better, purged of these Atlanteans, who are nothing but swine, nothing but robots, nothing but creatures who do not understand good and evil. Let them perish." His finger strikes a red button, and the rocket hurtles on its way to the sun. It will take several days to reach there, and meanwhile Gruad has gathered the Unbroken Circle on an airship, which takes them away from Atlantis, and into the huge mountains to the east, in a region that will one day be called Tibet. Gruad calculates that by the time the missile strikes the sun, they will have been landed and underground for 2 hours. The sun rides blinding yellow over the plains of Atlantis. It is a beautiful day on Zukong Gimorlad Saragossa, the sun shining down on its slender, graceful towers with spider-web bridges spiraling among them. Its parks, its temples, its museums, its fine public buildings and magnificent private palaces. Its handsome, richly furred people gracefully stride amidst the beauties of the first and the finest civilization man has ever produced. Families, lovers, friends, and enemies, all unsuspecting what is about to happen, enjoy their private moments. A quintet plays the melodious Zinthron, Balatet, Mordon, Swaz, and Fendrar. Overall, however, the great eye on the side of Gruad's pyramid glares horrid and red. Suddenly, the sun's body rages. Coiled flames, balls of gas, roll out. The sun looks like a giant fiery arachnid or octopus. One great flame comes rolling toward the earth, burning red gas which turns yellow, then green, then blue, then white. There is nothing left of Zukon Gimorlad Saragossa, except the pyramid with its upper segment now resting on the base, the anti-gravity generators having been destroyed. The baleful eye looks out over an absolutely flat, burnt black plain. The ground shakes, great cracks open. The blackened area is a great circle, hundreds of miles in diameter, beyond which is a dark brown and still, desolate wasteland. Thousands of cracks appear in the brittle surface of the continent, the strength of whose rocks have been destroyed by the incredible heat of the solar flare. A tide of mud starts crawling over the empty plain. It leaves only the top of the pyramid, with the great eye showing. Water sweeps over the mud, at first sinking in and standing in pools, then rising higher so that only the tip of the pyramid sticks out of a great lake. Under the water, enormous parallel fissures open in the ground on either side of the blackened central circle. The midsection of the continent, including the pyramid, begins to sink. The pyramid falls into the depths of the ocean with cliffs rising on either side of it, to the parts of Atlantis that still remain above the ocean. They will remain for many thousands of years more, and they will be the Atlantis remembered in the legends of men. But the true Atlantis, High Atlantis, is gone. Gruad stares into his crimson glowing viewplate, watching the destruction of Atlantis. The light changes color from red to gray, and the face of Gruad turns grey. It is a terrible face. It has aged 100 years in the last few minutes. Gruad may claim to be in the right, but deep down he knows that what he has done isn't nice. And yet deep down there is satisfaction, too, for Gruad, long tortured by unreasonable guilt, now has something he can really feel guilty about. He turns to the unbroken circle and proposes. Since it appears that the earth will survive the cataclysm, he was not really sure that it would, that they plan for the future. Most of them, however, are still in shock. Woe-Topod, inconsolable, stabs himself to death, the first recorded time that a member of the human race has deliberately killed himself. Gruad calls upon his followers to destroy all remains of the Atlantean civilization, and then, later, to build a perfect civilization when even the ruins of Atlantis have been forgotten. The great beasts that inhabited Europe, Asia, North America die off as a result of the mutations and diseases caused by the solar flare. All relics of the Atlantean civilization are destroyed. The people who were Gruad's erstwhile countrymen are either killed or driven forth to wander the earth. Besides Gruad's Himalayan colony, there is one other remnant of the High Atlantean era, the Pyramid of the Eye, whose ceramic substance resisted solar flare, earthquake, tidal wave, and submersion in the depths of the ocean. Gruad explains that it is right that the eye should remain. It is the eye of God, the One, the scientific, technical eye of ordered knowledge that looks down on the universe, and by perceiving it, causes it to be. If an event is not witnessed, it does not happen. Therefore, for the universe to happen, there must be a witness. Among the primitive hunters and gatherers, a mutation has appeared that seems to be spreading rapidly. More and more people are being born without fur, and with hair in the same pattern as Gruad's. The hour of God's eye has caused mutations in every species. From the Himalayas, the rocket ships of the unbroken circle, painted red and white, swoop out in squadrons. They sweep across Europe and land on the brown islands where Atlantis used to be. There they land and raid a city of refugees from the Atlantean disaster. They kill many of the leaders and intellectuals and herd the rest aboard the ships, fly to the Americas and deposit the helpless people on a vast plain. Far below their route of passage lies the Pyramid of the Eye at the bottom of the Atlantic. The base of the pyramid is covered with silt, and the break where the upper part of the pyramid had floated on anti-gravity projectors is also covered. Still, the pyramid itself towers over the mud around it. Taller by 3 times than the Great Pyramid of Egypt, the building of which lies 27,000 years in the future. A vast shadow descends upon the pyramid. There is a suggestion in the darkness of the ocean bottom of giant tentacles, of sucker discs wide as the rims of volcanoes, of an eye as big as the sun looking at the eye on the pyramid. Something touches the pyramid, and enormous as it is, it moves slightly. Then the presence is gone. The pentagonal trap in which the people of Atlantis had heroically and brilliantly caught the dread ancient being Yog-Sothoth has been, amazingly, undamaged by the catastrophe. Being on the southern plain, which was relatively uninhabited, the pentagon of Yog-Sothoth becomes the center of a migration of people who survived the disaster. Emergency cities are set up. Those dying of radiation sickness are treated. A second Atlantis begins to take root. And then, from the Himalayas, the ships of the Unbroken Circle come swooping down on one of their raids. Lines of Atlantean men and women are marched to the walls of the Pentagon and there mowed down by laser fire. Then explosive charges are placed amid the heaps of bodies, and the masked, uniformed men of the Unbroken Circle withdraw. There is a series of explosions. Horrid yellow smoke goes coiling up. The gray stone walls crumble. There is a moment of stillness, balance, tension. Then the piled-up boulders of one side of the wall fly apart as if thrust by the hand of a giant. An enormous claw print appears in the soft soil around the ruins of the Pentagon. The masked men of the unbroken circle race frantically for their ships and take off. The ships dart into the sky, stop suddenly, waver and plummet like stones to explosive crashes on the earth. The surviving refugees scream and scatter. Like a scythe going through wheat, death sweeps among them in great arcs as they run in massed mobs. Mouths open, in soundless screams they fall. Only a handful escapes. Over the scene a colossal reddish figure of indeterminate shape and number of limbs stands triumphant. In the Himalayas, Gruad and the Unbroken Circle watch the destruction of the Pentagon and the massacre of the Atlanteans. The Unbroken Circle cheers, but Gruad strangely weeps. "You think I hate walls," he says. "I love walls. I love any kind of wall, anything that separates. Walls protect good people. Walls lock away the evil. There must always be walls, and the love of walls. And in the destruction of the great Pentagon that held Yog-Sothoth, I read the destruction of all that I stand for. Therefore, I am stricken with regret." At this, the face of Evo, a young priest, takes on a reddish glow and a demoniac look. There is more than a hint of possession. "It is good to hear you say that," he says to Gruad. "No man yet has befriended me, though many have tried to use me. I have prepared a special place for your soul, O first of the men of the future." Gruad attempts to speak to Yog-Sothoth, but the possession has apparently passed, and the other members of the Unbroken Circle praise a new beverage that Evo has prepared, made of the fermented juice of grapes. At dinner, later that day, Gruad tries the new beverage and praises it, saying, "This juice of grapes relaxes me, and does not cause the disturbing visions and sounds that makes the herb the Atlanteans used to smoke so unpleasant for a man of conscience." Evo gives him more to drink from a fresh jar, and Gruad takes it. Before drinking, he says, "Any culture that arises in the next 20,000 years or so is going to have the rot of Atlantis in it. Therefore, I decree a non-cultural time of 800 generations. After that, we may allow man free rein on his propensity for building civilizations. The culture he builds will be under our guidance, with our ideas implicit in its every aspect, with our control at every stage. 800 generations from now, the new human culture will be planted. It will follow the natural law. It will have the knowledge of good and evil, the light that comes from the sun that blasphemers say is only an apple. It is no apple, I tell you, though it is a fruit, even as this beverage of Evo's that I now quaff is from a fruit. From the grape comes this drink, and from the sun comes the knowledge of good and evil, the separation of light and darkness over the whole earth. Not an apple, but the fruit of knowledge." Gruad drinks. He puts down his glass, clutches his throat, and staggers back. His other hand goes to his heart. He topples over and lies on his back, his eyes staring upward. Naturally, everyone accuses Evo of poisoning Gruad, but Evo calmly answers that it was Lilith Velkor who did it. He was doing research on the energies of the dead, and had learned how to take them into him. But sometimes the energies of the dead could take control of him, so that he would be just a medium through which they act. He cries, "When you write this tragedy into the archives, you must say, not that Evo the man did it, but Evo Lilith, possessed by the evil spirit of a woman. The woman did tempt me, I tell you. I was helpless." The Unbroken Circle is persuaded, and agree that since Lilith Velkor and the crazy goddess she worshipped were responsible for Gruad's death, henceforward women must be subordinate to men, so such evils will not be repeated. They decide to build a tomb for Gruad and to inscribe upon it, "The first illuminated one. Never trust a woman." They decide that since the Loigor is loose, they will offer sacrifices to it, and the sacrifices will be pure young women who have never lain with a man. Ivo seems to be taking control of the group, and Gua Tuon protests this. To prove his dedication to the true and the good, Ivo declares he has had his penis amputated as a sacrifice to the all-seeing eye. He pulls open his robe. All look at his truncated crotch and immediately retch. Ivo goes on. Furthermore, it is decreed by the eye and natural law that all male children who would be close to goodness and truth must imitate my sacrifice, at least to the extent of losing the foreskin or being cut enough to bleed. Kajetsi comes in at this point, and they plan a great funeral, agreeing that they will not burn Gruad, as was the Atlantean custom, signifying that one is dead forever, but will preserve his body, symbolizing the hope that he is not really dead, but will rise again. There follow several thousand years of warfare between the remnants of the Atlanteans and the inhabitants of Agarthy, the stronghold of the scientists, who now call themselves variously the knowledgeable or the enlightened ones. The last remnants of the Atlantean culture are destroyed. Great cities were built, then destroyed by nuclear explosions. All the inhabitants of the city of Pios are killed in one night by the Eater of Souls. Chunks of the continent break off and sink into the sea. There are earthquakes and tidal waves. Finally, only outcroppings like the cone-shaped island of Fernando Poo rise alone from the sea where Atlantis had been. About 13,000 BC, a new culture is planted on a hillside near the headwaters of the Euphrates, and it starts to spread. A tribe of Cro-Magnons, magnificently tall, strong, large-headed people, is marched at gunpoint down from the snows of Europe to the fertile lands of the Middle East. They are taken to the site chosen for the first agricultural settlement and shown how to plant crops. For several years they do so while the Unbroken Circle's men guard them with flamethrowers. Their generations pass rapidly, and once the new way of life has taken hold, the illuminated ones leave them alone. The tribe divides into kings, priests, scribes, warriors, and farmers. A city surrounded by farms rises up. The kings and priests are soft, weak, and fat. The peasants are stunted and dulled by malnutrition. The warriors are big and strong, but brutal and unintelligent. The scribes are intelligent, but thin and bloodless. Now the city makes war on neighboring tribes of barbarians. Being well organized and technologically superior, the people of the city win. They enslave the barbarians and plant other cities nearby. Then a great tribe of barbarians comes down from the north and conquers the civilized people and burns their city. This is not the end of the new civilization, though. It only revitalizes it. Soon, the conquerors have learned to play the roles of kings, priests, and warriors, and now there is a kind of nation consisting of several cities with a large body of armed men who must be kept occupied. Marching robot-like in great square formations, they set out over the plain to find new peoples to conquer. The sun shines down on the civilization created by the Illuminati, and below the sea, the eye on the pyramid glares balefully upward. The end.
Lights flashed on suddenly. The screen rolled up into its receptacle with a snap. Blinded, Joe rubbed his eyes. He had a ferocious headache. He also had a ferocious need to urinate at once before his bladder exploded. He'd had an awful lot of drinks at the plastic martini party, then made love to that Chinese girl in the cab, then sat down to watch this movie without once taking time out to go to the bathroom. The pain in his groin was excruciating. He imagined it felt something like what Ivo, that fellow in the movie, had experienced after he castrated himself.
"Where the hell is the John?"
said Joe loudly.
There was no one in the room. While he was absorbed in the movie, they, doubtless having seen it before, had crept away softly, leaving him alone to watch the death of Atlantis.
"Christ's sake,"
he muttered.
"Gotta take a leak. If I don't find the bathroom right away, I'll pee in my pants.
Then he noticed a wastepaper can under the table. It was walnut with a metal lining. He bent over and picked it up, sending new tremors of anguish through a body on the verge of bursting. He decided to use it as a receptacle, set it down again, unzipped his fly, took out his dick, and let go into the can. What if they all come trooping back into the room now, he thought. Well, he would be embarrassed, but what the hell? It was their fault for springing this movie on him without giving him a chance to make himself comfortable. Joe looked somberly down into the foam.
Piss on Atlantis,
he muttered. Who the hell were those people he'd seen tonight? Simon and Padre and Big John had never told him about a group like this, nor had they ever said anything about Atlantis. But there was the clear implication, if this movie was to be believed, that the ancient illuminated seers of Bavaria might better be called the ancient illuminated seers of Atlantis, and that the word ancient meant a lot older than 1776. It was clearly time to leave this place. He could try searching the offices, but he doubted whether he'd find anything, and anyway, he was much too tired and hungover. Not only from the alcohol he'd drunk, but also from the strange drug the Oriental girl had given him before the movie. Still, it had been a very nice drug. It had been Joe's habit since 1969, when he wasn't too busy and didn't have to get up early in the morning, to get stoned and watch late movies on television. He found this so enjoyable a pastime that he'd lost 2 girlfriends to it. They'd both wanted to go to bed when he was just settling down in front of the tube, laughing himself silly at the incredibly clever witticisms, marveling at the profundity of the philosophical aphorisms tossed off by the characters, such as Johnny's line in Bitter Rice. I work all week, and then on Sundays I watch other people ride the merry-go-round. What a world of pathos had been expressed in that simple summation of a man's life. Or appreciating, as one wordsmith does another, the complex subtlety of the commercials and the secret links between them and the movies into which they were inserted. Like the slogan, "You can take the Salem out of the country, but you can't take the country out of Salem," in the middle of The Wolfman. All of this capacity for appreciating movies had been raised to a new high with the drug Mao Sushi had given him, and added to this it was a full-color movie on a large screen, uninterrupted by commercials, or, come to think of it, by Fnords. And even commercials, no matter how trickily interwoven with the plot of the movie, did tend to seem like interruptions, even to one who was stoned enough to know better. It had been a great movie, the best movie of his life. He would never forget it. Joe tried the knob of the boardroom door, and it opened at once. He stopped, considering whether he should take out his pocket knife and carve "Malik was here" or some obscenity into the beautiful wood of the table. That would, he felt in an obscure way, let them know that he knew where they were at. But it would be a shame to spoil the wood, and besides, he was dreadfully tired. He walked through darkened outer corridors, staggered down the stairs, and let himself out into the street. Looking toward the East River, he thought he could see light in the sky over Queens. Was the sun coming up? Had he been there that long? A cab cruised by with its light on. Joe hailed it. Sinking into the back seat as he gave the driver his home address, he noticed that the man's name on the hack license was Albert Feather.
Well, here's that ladder now. Come on, let's climb. The first rung is yours, the rest are mine. Funny,
thought Lieutenant Otto Waterhouse of the state's attorney's police.
Every time things get hairy, that damn song starts going through my head. I must be an obsessive-compulsive neurotic.
He'd first heard the song To Be a Man by Len Chandler at the home of a chick he was balling back in '65. It expressed pretty well for him his condition as a member of the tribe. The tribe. That was how he thought of black people. He'd heard a Jew refer to the Jews that way, and he liked it better than that Soul Brothers shit. Deep down, he hated other blacks, and he hated being black. You had to climb, that was the thing. You had to climb, each man alone. When Otto Waterhouse was 8 years old, a gang of black kids on the south side had beaten him, knifed him, and thrown him into Lake Michigan to drown. Otto didn't know how to swim, but somehow he'd pulled himself along the concrete pilings, clinging to rusty steel where there was nothing to cling to, his blood seeping out into the water, and he stayed there hidden till the gang went away. Then he pulled himself along to a ladder, climbed up and dragged himself onto the concrete pier. He lay there, almost dead, wondering if the gang would come back and finish him. Someone did come along, a cop. The cop nudged Otto's body with his toe, rolled it over and looked down. Otto looked up at the Irish face, round, pig-nosed and blue-eyed. "Oh, shit," said the cop, and walked on. Somehow, Otto lived till morning, when a woman came along and found him and called an ambulance. Years later, it seemed logical enough to him to join the police force. He knew the members of the gang that nearly killed him. He didn't bother with them until after he got on the force. Then he found cause to kill each of the gang members, several of whom had by then become respectable citizens, one by one. Most of them didn't know who he was or why he was killing them. The number he killed made his reputation in the Chicago Police Department. He was a nigger cop who could be trusted to deal with niggers. Otto never did know who the cop was who'd left him to die. He remembered the face, more or less, but they all looked alike to him. He had another oddly vivid memory of a fall day in 1970 when he'd been walking through Pioneer Court and had hassled a dude who was giving out free samples of all things, tomato juice. Otto took a 10 from the dude and drank some tomato juice. The guy had a crew haircut and wore horn-rimmed glasses. He didn't seem to mind having to pay a bribe, and he looked at Otto with an odd gleam in his eye as the tomato juice went down. For a moment, Otto thought the tomato juice might be poisoned. There were cop haters everywhere. Many people seemed to have sworn to kill the pigs, as they called them, but dozens of people had already drunk the juice and gone away happy. Otto shrugged and walked off. Thinking back over the strange changes that had come over him, Otto always traced them back to that moment. There had been something in the juice. It wasn't till Stella Maris had told him about that he realized how he'd been had, and by then it was too late. He was a three-way loser, working for the Syndicate, the Illuminati, and Discordian movement. The only way out was down into the chaos, with Stella pointing the way.
Just tell me one thing, baby,
he said to her one afternoon as they lay naked together in his apartment in Hyde Park.
Why did they pick you to contact me?
Because you hate niggers,
said Stella calmly, running her finger down his dick.
You hate niggers worse than any white man does. That's why the way to freedom for you lies through me.
And what about you?
He said angrily, pulling away from her and sitting up in bed.
I suppose you can't tell the difference between black and white. Black meat and white meat, it's all the same to you, ain't it, you goddamn whore?
You'd like to think so,
said Stella.
You'd like to think that only a nigger whore would lay you, a whore who'd lay anybody regardless of race. But you know you are wrong. You know that Otto Waterhouse, the black man who is better than all black men, because he hates all black men, is a lie. It's you who can't tell the difference between black and white, and thinks the black man should be where the white man is, and hates the black man because he isn't white. No, I see color, but I see everything else about a person too, baby. And I know that nobody is where they should be, and everybody should be where they are.
Oh, fuck your goddamn philosophy,
said Waterhouse.
Come here.
But he learned. He thought he'd learned everything Stella and Hagbard and the rest of them had to teach him, and that was a lot, piled on top of all that Illuminati garbage. But now they'd thrown him a total curve. He was to kill. The message came, as all the messages did, from Stella.
Hagbard said to do this.
Yes.
And I suppose if I go along with this, I'll be told why later on, or I'll figure it out for myself. God damn, Stella, this is asking a lot, you know.
I know. Hagbard told me to have you do this for 2 reasons. First, for the honor of the Discordians, so that they will have respect.
He sounds like a wop for once, but he's right. I understand that.
Second, he said because Otto Waterhouse must kill a white man.
What?
Otto started to tremble in the phone booth. He picked nervously, without reading it, a sticker that said, "This phone booth reserved for Clark Kent."
Otto Waterhouse must kill a white man. He said you'd know what that meant.
Otto's hand was still shaking when he hung up.
Oh, damn,
he said. He was almost crying. So now, on April 28th, he stood at a green metal door marked 1723. It was the service entrance to a condominium apartment at 2323 Lakeshore Drive. Behind him stood a dozen state's attorney's police. All of them, like himself, were wearing body armor and baby blue helmets with transparent plastic visors. 2 were carrying submachine guns.
All right,
said Waterhouse, glancing at his watch. It had amused Flanagan to set the time for the raid at 5:23 a.m. It was 5:22 and 30 seconds.
Remember, Shoot everything that moves.
He kept his back to the men so they would not see the damn tears that insisted on welling up in his eyes.
Right on, Lieutenant,
said Sergeant O'Banion satirically. Sergeant O'Banion hated blacks, but worse than that, he hated filthy, lice-ridden, long-haired, homosexual, communist-inspired mortuary bomb manufacturers. He believed that there was a whole disgusting nest of them, sleeping together, dirty naked bodies entwined, like a can full of worms, just on the other side of that green metal door. He could see them. He licked his lips. He was going to clean them out. He hefted the machine gun.
Okay,
said Waterhouse. It was 5:23. Shielding himself with one gloved hand, he pointed his .45 at the lock on the door. The instructions given orally by Flanagan at the briefing were that they would not show a warrant or even knock before entering. The apartment was said to be full of enough dynamite to wipe out the entire block of luxury high-rise apartments. Presumably the kids, if they knew they were caught, would set them off. That way, they could take a bunch of pigs with them, preserve their reputation for suicidal bravery, protect themselves from giving away any information, use the explosives, and avoid having to live with the shaming knowledge that they'd been dumb enough to get caught. O'Banion was imagining finding a white girl in the arms of a black boy and finishing them off with one burst from his machine gun. His cock swelled in his pants. Waterhouse fired. In the next instant, he threw his weight against the door and smashed it open. He was in a hallway next to the kitchen. He walked into the apartment. His shoes rang on a bare tile floor. Tears ran down his cheeks.
My God, why have you forsaken me?
He sobbed.
Who's that?
A voice called. Waterhouse, whose eyes had adjusted to the darkness, looked across the empty living room into the foyer, where Milo A. Flanagan stood, silhouetted in the light from the exterior hall. Waterhouse raised the heavy automatic in his hand to arm's length, sighted carefully, took a deep breath and held it, and squeezed the trigger. The pistol blasted and kicked his hand, and the black figure went toppling backwards into the startled arms of the men behind him. A bat, which had been sitting on a windowsill, flew out the open window toward the lake. Only Waterhouse saw it. O'Banion came clumping into the room. He took a bent-kneed stance and fired a burst of 6 rounds in the direction of the front door.
Hold it!
Waterhouse snapped.
Hold your fire! Something's wrong!
Something would really be wrong if the guys at the front door came through again shooting.
Turn on the lights, O'Banion,
Waterhouse said.
There's somebody in here shooting.
We're standing here talking, O'Banion. No one is shooting at us. Find a light switch.
They're going to set off the bombs.
O'Banion's voice was shrill with fear.
With the lights on, O'Banion, we'll see them doing it. Maybe we'll even be able to stop them.
O'Banion ran to the wall and began slapping it with the palm of one hand while he kept his machine gun cradled in the free arm. One of the other men who had followed O'Banion through the service entrance found the light switch. The apartment was bare. There was no furniture. There were no rugs on the floor, no curtains on the windows. Whoever had been living here had vanished. The front door opened a crack. Before they could start shooting, Waterhouse yelled,
"It's all right! It's Waterhouse in here! There's nobody here!"
He wasn't crying anymore. It was done. He had killed his first white man. The door swung all the way open.
"Nobody there?"
said the helmeted policeman.
"Who the hell shot Flanagan?"
"Flanagan?"
said Waterhouse.
"Flanagan's dead. They got him."
"There isn't anybody here,"
said O'Banion, who had been looking through side rooms.
"What the hell went wrong? Flanagan set this up personally."
Now that the light was on, Waterhouse could see that someone had drawn a pentagram in chalk on the floor. In the center of the pentagram was a gray envelope. Otto picked it up. There was a circular green seal on the back and the words Heiress embossed on it. Otto opened it and read,
"Good going, Otto. Now proceed at once to Ingolstadt, Bavaria. The bastards are trying to immanentize the eschaton. S.M."
Folding the note and shoving it into his pocket as he holstered his pistol with his other hand, Otto Waterhouse strode across the living room. He barely glanced down at the body of Milo A. Flanagan, the bullet hole in the center of his forehead like a third eye. Hagbard had been right. Despite all the advanced terror and sorrow, once he'd done it, he didn't feel a thing. "I have met the enemy, and he is mine," he thought. Otto pushed past the men crowded around Flanagan's body. Everyone assumed he was going somewhere to make some sort of report. No one had figured out who shot Flanagan. By the time O'Banion had puzzled it out, Otto was already in his car. 6 hours later, when they had set up blockades at the airports and railway terminals, Otto was in Minneapolis International Airport buying a ticket to Montreal. He had to fly back to Chicago, but he sat out the brief stopover at O'Hare International Airport aboard the plane, while his brother officers searched the terminals for him. 12 hours later, carrying a passport supplied by Montreal Discordians, Otto Waterhouse was on his way to Ingolstadt.
Ingolstadt,
said Fuckup. Hagbard had programmed the machine to converse in reasonably good English this week.
the largest rock festival in the history of mankind. The largest temporary gathering of human beings ever assembled will take place near Ingolstadt on the shore of Lake Totenkopf. 2 million young people from all over the world are expected. The American Medical Association will play.
Did you know or suspect before this that the American Medical Association, Wolfgang, Werner, Wilhelm, and Winifred Saure are 4 of the Illuminati Primi?
Asked Hagbard.
They were on a list, but 14th in order of probability,
said Fuckup.
Perhaps some of the other groups I suspected are Illuminati Veri.
Can you now state the nature of the crisis that we will face this week?
There was a pause.
There were 3 crises for this month, plus several sub-crises designed to bring the 3 major crises to a peak. The first was Fernando Poo. The world nearly went to war over the Fernando Poo coup, but the Illuminati had a counter-coup in reserve, and that resolved the problem satisfactorily. Heads of state are human, and this feint has helped to make them jumpier and more irrational. They are in no shape to react wisely to the next 2 jolts. Unless you wish me to continue discussing the character structures of the present heads of state, which are important elements in the crises through which the world is passing, I will proceed to the next crisis. This is Las Vegas. I still do not know exactly what is going on there, but the sickness vibrations are still coming through strongly. There is, I have deduced from recently acquired information, a bacteriological warfare research center located in the desert somewhere near Las Vegas. One of my more mystical probes came up with the sentence, "The ace in the hole is poisoned candy." But that's one of those things we probably won't understand until we find out what's going on in Las Vegas by more conventional means.
I've already dispatched Muldoon and Goodman there,
said Hagbard.
All right, Fuckup. Obviously, the 3rd crisis is Ingolstadt. What's going to happen at that rock festival?
They intend to use the Illuminati science of strategic biomysticism. Lake Totenkopf is one of Europe's famed bottomless lakes, which means it has an outlet into the underground Sea of Valusia. At the end of World War II, Hitler had an entire SS division in reserve in Bavaria. He was planning to withdraw to Obersalzberg and with this fanatically loyal division make a glorious last stand in the Bavarian Alps. Instead, the Illuminati convinced him that he still had a chance to win the war, if he followed their instructions. Hitler, Himmler and Bormann fed cyanide to all the troops, killing several thousand of them. Then their bodies, dressed in full field equipment, were placed by divers on a huge underground plateau near where the Sea of Valusia surfaces as Lake Totenkopf. Their boots were weighted at the bottom so that they would stand at attention. The airplanes, tanks and artillery assigned to the division were also weighted and sunk along with the troops. Many of them, by the way, knew that there was cyanide in their last supper, but they ate it anyway. If the Führer thought it best to kill them, that was good enough for them.
I can't imagine there would be much left of them after over 30 years,
said Hagbard.
You are wrong as usual, Hagbard,
said FUCKUP.
The SS men were placed under a biomystical protective field. The entire division is as good as it was the day it was placed there. Of course, the Illuminati had tricked Hitler and Himmler. The real purpose of the mass sacrifice was to provide enough explosively released consciousness energy to make it possible to translate Bormann to the immortal energy plane. Bormann, one of the Illuminati Primi of his day, was to be rewarded for his part in organizing World War II. The 50 million violent deaths of that war helped many Illuminati to achieve transcendental illumination, and were most pleasing to their elder brothers and allies, the Lewaigor.
And what will happen at Ingolstadt during the festival?
The American Medical Association's 5th number at Woodstock, Europa, will send out biomystical waves that will activate the Nazi legions in the lake and send them marching up the shore. They will be, in their resurrection, endowed with supernormal strength and energy, making them almost impossible to kill. And they will achieve even greater powers as a result of the burst of consciousness energy that will be released when they massacre the millions of young people on the shore. Then, led by the Saures, they will turn against Eastern Europe. The Russians, already made extremely nervous by the Fernando Poo incident, will think an army is attacking them from the west. Their old fear that Germany will once again, with the help of the capitalist powers, rise up and attack Russia and slaughter Russians for the 3rd time in this century will become a reality. They will find that conventional weapons will not stop the resurrected Nazis. They will believe they are up against some new kind of American superweapon, that the Americans have decided to launch a sneak attack. The Russians will then start bringing superweapons of their own into play. Then the Illuminati will play their ace in the hole in Las Vegas. Whatever that is.
The voice of the computer, coming from Hagbard's Polynesian teakwood desk, was suddenly silent.
What happens after that?
Said Hagbard, leaning forward tensely. George saw perspiration on his forehead.
It doesn't matter what happens after that,
said FUCKUP.
If the situation develops as I project, the eschaton will have been immanentized. For the Illuminati, that will mean the fulfillment of the project that has been their goal since the days of Gruard. A total victory. They will all simultaneously achieve transcendental illumination. For the human race, on the other hand, that will be extinction. The end.